Cities are a version of history that gets stored in classrooms, in textbooks, in the grand marble halls of museums. It features generals on horseback. It features men in medals. It features the thundering of cannons and the signing of treaties. And then cities through other version. The version that gets buried. The version that gets quietly set aside, not because it isn't true, but perhaps because it is too inconvenient to be true. This is that other version. When you think about the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, the most feared military mind in a generation, the man who rewrote the map of Europe not once but repeatedly, the man who once declared that he could not be stopped by the armies of kings, you probably imagine the frozen wasteland of the Russian campaign, the catastrophic retreat, the mood-soaked fields of Waterloo, the distant island of St. Helena where he would die, diminished and bitter, with nothing left but his memories. You do not think about women, and that is exactly the way certain people in power wanted it. But here is the truth. And it is a truth that has been painstakingly reconstructed by historians who dug through censored archives, through letters that were never meant to be read, through testimonies that were almost lost entirely. Here is the truth. The collapse of Napoleon's empire was not only the result of military failure, geographic misfortune, or coalition armies. It was, in no more small part, engineered, sustained, and carried forward by networks of women who organized, who sacrificed, who fought, who died, and whose names were systematically erased from that record. This is not metaphor. This is not romanticism. This is documented history that has been suppressed for over 2 centuries. And it begins, as so many buried stories do, not with a battle, but with a hunger. You have to understand what Napoleonic Europe felt like to live in if you were not a soldier, not a nobleman, not a man of property. If you were a woman, if you were a mother watching your sons conscripted year after year into a war machine that consumed them and sent back nothing but grief. If you were a peasant woman whose grain was requisitioned for an army that never asked permission. If you were a middle-class woman in a city under occupation, watching foreign soldiers patrol streets where you once walked freely. Napoleon liked to speak of glory. He was extraordinarily good at the language of glory. He understood that men would follow a vision, would die for an idea, if that idea was dressed in the right clothing. And he clothed his empire in magnificent, seductive clothing, grandeur, destiny. The idea that France was not merely a nation but a civilizing force, a new Rome, bringing order and enlightenment to a chaotic continent. But glory does not feed children, and women noticed that. By the time Napoleon's Grande Armée began its catastrophic march into Russia in June of 1812, the empire was already fraying at its edges in ways that official histories tend to minimize. Spain was a bleeding wound that refused to close. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to economically strangle Britain by blocking all European trade with the island, had instead strangled the fatty populations it was supposed to protect. Unemployment was rising, food prices were destabilizing, and conscription had reached into families that had already given everything they had to give. In Spain, in Prussia, in the Austrian territory, in Russia itself, and most dramatically in the German states that Napoleon had reorganized into compliant satellites, something was beginning to coil beneath the surface. A resistance, not yet organized, not yet named, but alive, and women were at its center from the very beginning. To understand what these women did, you have to understand the world they were operating in, because they were not operating in a world that gave them any formal power whatsoever. Under the Napoleonic Code, the legal framework that Napoleon had introduced across his empire and which he considered one of his greatest achievements, women were legally classified as dependents. A married woman could not own property without her husband's permission. She could not make contracts. She could not testify in court under most circumstances. She could not participate in political life. She was, in the eyes of the law, a permanent minor. Napoleon himself was remarkably candid about this. He believed women were fundamentally unsuited for public life. He believed their role was reproductive and domestic. He wrote letters, he gave speeches, he enacted policy that codified this belief into stone. What he did not account for was what happens when you strip a group of people of every formal avenue of power. What happens is that they become extraordinarily skilled at informal power, at operating in the spaces between the rules, at building structures that the law cannot see because the law was never written to look at them. That is exactly what happened. Let us begin in Spain, because Spain is where the template was set. Spain is where the world first saw what organized civilian resistance in which women played an absolutely central role could do to a Napoleonic army. The Peninsular War began in 1808. Napoleon, wanting to replace the Spanish Bourbon monarchy with his brother Joseph, effectively invaded and occupied Spain. What he expected was a conventional response, armies in the field, negotiations, eventual submission. What he got was something entirely different. He got the guerrilla. The word itself is Spanish. It means, literally, little war, and it was pioneered not by generals but by civilians, farmers, priests, local leaders, and overwhelmingly, women who had decided that survival required resistance. In the cities that fell under French occupation, Saragossa, Madrid, Seville, women organized supply networks that kept resistance fighters fed, clothed, and armed. They acted as couriers, moving messages through checkpoints that French soldiers manned, because French soldiers, trained to look for armed men, did not know how to read the meaning of a woman carrying a basket of bread. They organized safe houses. They recruited. They kept records of French troop movements and passed those records to guerrilla commanders operating in the hills. And sometimes they fought directly. The name Agustina of Aragon is not entirely forgotten, though it deserves to be far better known than it is. During the siege of Saragossa in 1808, when French artillery had broken through the outer defenses and the Spanish gun crews had been killed, a young woman named Agustina Domingo Simen walked to the abandoned cannon, loaded it herself, and fired it into the advancing French troops. She held her position. The French advance stalled. The story spread through the city and through Spain like fire, because people needed something to hold on to, and she gave them something real. Francisco Goya painted her. She became a symbol, but she was not an anomaly. She was the visible edge of something much larger and far more organized than history has generally acknowledged. The women of Spain built what amounted to a parallel intelligence network. In Navarre, in Catalonia, in Andalusia, local women's networks coordinated the movement of information about French supply lines, troop concentrations, and officer locations. This information made its way to guerrilla commanders like Francisco Esposia Mina, who used it to conduct raids of extraordinary precision. Mina himself credited local informants, many of them women, with providing intelligence he could not have obtained any other way. Wellington, commanding the British forces fighting alongside Spanish guerrillas, noted in his dispatches that the French were being bled not primarily in pitched battles but through constant attrition, harassment, and disruption of their supply lines. He did not always name the sources of that disruption, but the sources were set in the archives if you looked, and they were female. Napoleon would eventually refer to Spain as his Spanish ulcer, a wound that would not heal, that drained men and resources from his empire year after year. The guerrilla campaign in Spain tied down somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 French troops at the height of the war. Troops that were not available for other campaigns. Troops that were, in a very real sense, neutralized. The women of Spain helped neutralize them. Now move north. Move to Prussia in 1813, because what happened there is even more remarkable and even more thoroughly buried. After the catastrophic failure of the Russian campaign, in which the Grande Armée, once over 600,000 strong, was reduced to a frozen, starving remnant, Napoleon's empire entered a period of acute crisis. Conquered territory that had been held in submission by the sheer weight of French military dominance began to sense that the weight was lifting. Nowhere was this more true than in Prussia. Prussia had been humiliated in 1806. Napoleon had crushed the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Ostend in a single October day, an act so complete and so swift that it had stunned Europe. The Prussian state was reduced to atom. Its best territory were stripped away. It was forced to pay enormous indemnities. Its military was capped at 42,000 men. That number 42,000 is important, because the Prussian reformers who gathered in the years after 1806 understood that they would need to defeat Napoleon without being able to rebuild a conventional army large enough to do it. They would need other means, and other means meant other people. It meant the population, it meant the landwehr, the militia system, and it meant women. Queen Louise of Prussia had died in 1810, but her legacy was very much alive. Louise had been extraordinary, a woman of genuine political intelligence who had personally negotiated with Napoleon after Prussia's defeat, who had advocated for her people in the face of contemptuous condescension from the French emperor, and who had become, in her relatively short life, a symbol of Prussian dignity and resistance. Her death had not diminished her symbolic power. If anything, it had concentrated it. She had become a martyr figure. And martyr figures are extraordinarily useful tools for mobilization. In the winter of 1813, as Prussia prepared to re-enter the war against Napoleon, something unprecedented happened. Queen Louise's daughter, Princess Wilhelmine, along with a circle of noblewomen centered around the Prussian court, organized what became known as the Women's Association for the Good of the Fatherland. It was the first of its kind in Prussian history. Within months, chapters of the organization had spread across Prussian territory. Within a year, over 100 similar organizations had formed across the German states. What did they do? Everything that fell outside the formal military structure. They organized field hospitals. They trained women as nurses and medics at a time when the concept of organized military medicine was still extraordinarily primitive. They raised money. They melted down their own jewelry, and here the symbolism was very deliberately cultivated, exchanging gold rings for iron rings stamped with the words "E gave gold for iron." They collected supplies. They manufactured bandages by the millions. They coordinated the provision of food and shelter for wounded soldiers making their way back through the rear areas. But they also did something harder to quantify and perhaps more important. They maintained morale. In a society exhausted by war and occupation, they built and maintained the psychological infrastructure of resistance. They wrote, they organized, they created the social and emotional framework within which men could continue to fight. Eleanor Prohaska is a name that almost no one knows today. She was a young Prussian woman who, in 1813, disguised herself as a man, enlisted in a volunteer Jäger unit, and fought through multiple engagements before being mortally wounded at the Battle of the Gay. When her identity was discovered after she was wounded, the reaction of the military command was not condemnation but something approaching reverence. She had fought well. She had fought bravely, and her story was used, deliberately, as a propaganda instrument to motivate the population. But propaganda requires a foundation of reality. And the reality was that Prohaska was not alone. She was simply the most visible of a number of women who were participating directly in the military resistance. Others remained hidden. Others carried on what that was never given a military designation but was no more less essential. The campaign of 1813, the War of Liberation, as Prussians came to call it, ended at the Battle of Leipzig in October of that year, the largest battle in European history up to that point. Napoleon was defeated and forced to retreat to France. The role of women in building, sustaining, and supporting the coalition that defeated him at Leipzig has been acknowledged in passing by some historians and ignored entirely by most. But there is a thread here that connects Spain to Prussia to something that happened in the East, something that has been buried even more deeply than the rest. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, he was entering a country that he fundamentally misunderstood. He understood Russia as a military problem. He did not understand it as a social and human problem. He did not understand what motivated the Russian people, particularly the peasant population, which composed the overwhelming majority of the country. The official Russian military response to the French invasion, under the command of Mikhail Kutuzov, was a deliberate strategic retreat that drew the French army deeper and deeper into Russian territory. The French took Smolensk. They took Moscow itself, only to find it burning. The city had been set on fire before they arrived. They found a city without people, without supplies, without the capitulation they expected. Napoleon waited in Moscow for weeks, expecting the Russian Tsar Alexander to negotiate. No more negotiation came. What has been thought about this campaign focuses on the military, the battles, the retreat, the code, the starvation. What has been less told is the parallel campaign of civilian resistance, the partisan warfare that operated behind French lines throughout the occupation of Russian territory. And within that civilian resistance, women played roles that the Russian imperial censors would spend the next century carefully managing. The most famous name is Nadezhda Durova. Her story is remarkable. She disguised herself as a male cavalry officer, served in the Russian army for years, participated in multiple campaigns including the battles of 1807 against Napoleon, and was eventually awarded the Cross of St. George, Russia's highest military honor. When her identity was revealed, Tsar Alexander himself learned of her identity and granted her permission to continue serving. She became a celebrated figure. She later wrote a memoir that is one of the most extraordinary documents of the Napoleonic era. But Durova, again, was the visible edge. In the villages and towns of Western Russia that fell under French occupation, women organized the kind of resistance that left very little written record because it was local, improvised, and dangerous. Women hid weapons. Women provided shelter to Russian irregulars and stragglers. Women acted as guides for partisan bands moving through terrain they knew intimately. Women poisoned wells, not a metaphor but a literal act of denial of resources that contributed to the logistical nightmare the French army experienced in occupied Russia. Vasilisa Kozhina was a head woman of a small estate near Sichevka who organized her fellow serfs, men and women, both into a partisan unit that captured dozens of French stragglers. She is depicted in a famous painting, commanding her group with a scythe in hand. The image is iconic but also in some ways misleading, because it reduces her to an image of peasant ferocity rather than acknowledging what she actually represented, an organizational capability. A willingness to lead, a refusal to be passive that was replicated, in different forms, across hundreds of Russian communities. The Russian partisan campaign of 1812 is estimated to have contributed significantly to the destruction of French forces during the retreat. French units were harassed, ambushed, and interdicted by partisan groups operating throughout the occupied zone. The logistical system upon which a conventional army depends, the flow of supplies, the security of communications lines, the ability to forage, was systematically disrupted, and women were part of every element of that disruption, from the tactical to the organizational to the psychological. Russia's official imperial historiography in the 19th century was deeply uncomfortable with this truth. The story the sadist state wanted to tell about 1812 was a story of military heroism, of noble generals, of the glorious Russian army. The story of peasant women with sieges and hidden stores of weapons did not fit that narrative comfortably, and so it was managed, acknowledged in certain controlled ways, set aside in others. There is another dimension to this story that goes beyond the battlefield and the occupation zone, because the defeat of Napoleon was not only a military event, It was an economic and political event, and in the economic and political dimensions of the struggle, women played roles that are almost entirely invisible in standard historical accounts. The continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade of Britain, was supposed to be his weapon of mass economic destruction against his most persistent enemy. If he could shut off British trade with the European continent, he could strangle the British economy, deny the British government the revenues it needed to subsidize anti-French coalitions, and eventually force Britain to make peace. It was a reasonable theory. In practice, it was a catastrophic failure, and one of the primary reasons it was a catastrophic failure was that it was systematically violated. Smuggling networks across the continent kept goods moving in defiance of French enforcement, and those smuggling networks, in many parts of Europe, were organized and operated by women. This was not accidental. Women occupied a peculiar legal position in Napoleonic Europe that made them useful instruments of economic resistance. Because they were classified as legal dependents, they were in many cases not held to the same degree of legal accountability as men. A woman caught with contraband British goods might face punishment, but the institutional attention of the state was primarily directed at men. Women could move through markets, through households, through social spaces that men could not access as easily. Women managed household economies and therefore controlled the point of consumption where contraband goods ultimately arrived. In Hamburg, in Amsterdam, in the Hanseatic port cities that Napoleon had incorporated into his empire specifically to enforce the continental system, women's networks became central to the smuggling trade. Merchants' wives managed complex financial arrangements for the movement of goods. Market women served as distribution nodes. Women running boarding houses and inns provided cover and storage. The result was that the continental system was, across wide swaths of Europe, effectively a fiction. Napoleon's own brother Louis, whom Napoleon had made King of Holland, refused to enforce the system rigorously because it was destroying the Dutch economy and creating instability he could not manage. Napoleon eventually annexed Holland directly, but the violations continued. And they continued in no more small part because the networks that sustained them included, centrally, women who had good practical reasons to keep them running and whom the French enforcement apparatus was not well designed to monitor or suppress. The economic holes in the continental system contributed directly to Napoleon's decision to invade Russia. Russia was also violating the system, allowing British goods in through Baltic ports, and that invasion, of course, ended in catastrophe. The chain of causation runs from smuggling networks to the Russian campaign to the destruction of the Grande Army, and women were links in the chain. There is a figure in this story who deserves extended treatment, because her life encapsulates so much of what has been buried. Her name was Caroline von Humboldt. She was the wife of Wilhelm von Humboldt, the Prussian diplomat and philosopher. She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, deep political awareness, and a clarity of analysis that many of the men around her did not possess. During the years of Prussian subjugation after 1806, while her husband worked within official channels, Caroline operated in the social and informal political spaces that were, in practice, where the real work of building resistance coalitions happened. The salon was the political institution of the era, and salons were run by women. In Berlin, in Vienna, in Warsaw, the drawing rooms of intelligent and well-connected women were where diplomats spoke informally, where alliances were floated as hypotheticals before they could be proposed officially, where information traveled that could not travel through official channels because those channels were monitored by French intelligence. Rahel Varnhagen, Henriette Herz, Dorothea von Schlegel. These women ran salons in Berlin during the period of French occupation that became, in effect, nodes of intellectual and political resistance. They were Jewish women, which added another layer of complexity to their position. Napoleon had, in some respects, improved the legal situation of Jews in the territory he controlled, extending civic rights that had previously been denied. This created genuine ambivalence in some Jewish communities about the French occupation. But the salon women of Berlin were not naive about empire. They understood that formal legal improvement could coexist with cultural and political degradation, and their salons became spaces where the ideas of German nationalism, ideas that would ultimately fuel the resistance to Napoleon, were developed, debated, and disseminated. The connection between these intellectual salons and the eventual military and political defeat of Napoleon is indirect but real. The ideas of German national identity, of the Volk, of resistance to foreign domination, were forged in significant part in spaces that women controlled and curated. When those ideas eventually produced the political will for the War of Liberation in 1813, women had been building that will for years. The women of this story paid prices that history has not recorded adequately. For every woman whose story was partially preserved, Agustina of Aragon, Eleanor Prohaska, Nadezhda Durova, Vasilisa Kozhina, there were thousands whose names were never written down. Women who were caught carrying messages and executed. Women who sheltered partisans and were punished when those partisans were found. Women who organized resistance cells that were infiltrated and destroyed by French intelligence, taking their organizers with them. French military justice during the Peninsular War was extraordinarily brutal. The guerrilla campaign in Spain prompted reprisals that targeted civilian populations indiscriminately. The records from these campaigns contain accounts of women among those executed for resistance activity. The numbers are incomplete because record keeping in occupied territory was inconsistent and because, again, the frameworks being used to document military events were not designed to capture the activities of women unless those activities were spectacular enough to demand attention. In Russia, the peasant women who engaged in partisan resistance operated entirely outside any protective legal framework. They were serfs, which meant they were legally property rather than persons in the eyes of Russian law. Their participation in resistance was therefore doubly invisible to historians because it was informal and undocumented, and invisible to the legal system because the people doing it had no more legal personhood to begin with. The cost was real and it was steep, and it was paid by people whose names we do not know. Why was this history buried? This is the question that matters. Because the burial was not accidental, it was a product of choices made by the people who controlled the production of history in the 19th century. After the defeat of Napoleon, Europe was reorganized at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815. The great powers Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, France drew them up and established the framework of international relations that would govern the continent for the next century. The political philosophy that animated the Congress of Vienna was conservative. It was, explicitly, a reaction against the revolutionary impulses that had produced Napoleon. The men who gathered in Vienna wanted stability. They wanted order. They wanted the pre-revolutionary social hierarchy reasserted as firmly as possible. Women's political participation, even the informal, uncoded, and documented political participation that had contributed to Napoleon's defeat was profoundly inconvenient for this project. If women had demonstrated that they could organize, lead, assist, fight, and contribute decisively to major political outcomes, then the argument for keeping them entirely outside formal political life became harder to sustain. The argument for the Napoleonic Code's classification of women as legal dependents became harder to sustain. The solution, not always consciously chosen but consistently applied, was to manage the narrative. To celebrate the women who fit comfortably into existing categories, the self-sacrificing nurse, the symbolic martyr figure like Queen Louise, the peasant woman whose ferocity was charming in its primitive simplicity, and to minimize or ignore the women who demonstrated political intelligence, organizational capability, and strategic thinking. Agustina of Aragon was celebrated. But she was celebrated as a symbol of passionate national feeling, of instinctive courage, rather than as a person who made tactical decisions under fire. Vasilisa Kozhina was painted and praised. The Salon women of Berlin, the people who had spent years building the intellectual foundations of the resistance, were remembered primarily as hostesses rather than as political actors. The women who had organized supply networks, intelligence networks, smuggling networks, the people doing the unglamorous, structural, essential work that made everything else possible, were simply not recorded in ways that the historical tradition was equipped to see. And then, in the 19th century, as professional academic history developed as a discipline, the absence of women from the formal record became self-reinforcing. Professional historians, almost exclusively Mala, worked with the sources that existed, and the sources that existed were the ones that the Mala-dominated recording apparatus of the era had produced. Women who did not appear in official military records, government documents, or published memoirs were invisible, and their invisibility confirmed the presumption that they had not been historically significant, which justified not looking for them, which maintained their invisibility. It is a closed loop, and it is a loop that historians have only been systematically breaking in the last several decades. The work of recovery has been extraordinary, and it has been driven by historians, many of them women, who decided to look at the archives differently, to look not at the official military records but at the letters that soldiers sent home, which sometimes describe what women were doing in the occupied territory, to look at the records of French intelligence services, which documented the activities they were trying to suppress and therefore, inadvertently, documented the activities of the women they were trying to suppress, to look at church records, market records, household accounts, the administrative documentation of occupied territory, sources that the traditional historiography of warfare considered irrelevant and which turned out to be richly informative. What they found was not a simple story of heroic women fighting an evil empire. What they found was complicated and human and often morally ambiguous, as real history always is. They found women who collaborated with the French occupation because they or their families had practical reasons to do so. They found women who used the chaos of war to pursue personal agendas that had nothing to do with national resistance. They found women whose motivations were mixed, whose actions were inconsistent, who made choices that were shaped by fear and hunger and exhaustion as much as by ideology. But they also found the networks. The intelligence networks in Spain and the supply networks in Prussia and the partisan units in Russia and the smuggling operations across the continental system. They found evidence of organized, sustained, rational collective action by women who understood the political situation they were in and chose to act on that understanding. They found the forgotten army. There is something important to say here about what this history means, because there is a temptation, in recovering buried history, to swing to the opposite extreme, to replace one distorted story with another, to take the story of Napoleon's defeat and simply substitute women for men as the primary agents. That is not what the evidence shows. Napoleon was defeated by a combination of factors: his own strategic overreach, the logistical impossibility of sustaining an empire of that scale with the technology of the early 19th century, the resilience of Britain as a maritime and commercial power, the willingness of Russia to absorb catastrophic losses rather than negotiate, the eventual coalition of European states that was able to concentrate overwhelming military force against him. What the evidence shows is that women were part of every element of the resistance that ultimately destroyed his empire, that their contributions were real, were significant, and in some contexts were decisive, that without the partisan networks in Spain, the logistics support in Prussia, the civilian resistance in Russia, and the economic disruption of the continental system, the timeline of Napoleon's defeat would have been different and possibly longer. And what the evidence shows is that this reality was deliberately managed out of the historical record for reasons that had nothing to do with historical accuracy and everything to do with the political interests of the men who controlled the production of history in the 19th century. That is not a minor thing. The erasure of women from the history of Napoleon's defeat is not simply an omission. It is an act. It is a choice, repeated across decades and across institutions, to maintain a fiction about who has the capacity for historical agency, for political action, for resistance. There is a letter in the Prussian state archives. It was written in December of 1813, in the weeks after the Battle of Leipzig, by a woman whose name was Louise von Plotz. She was the director of one of the field hospital networks that the Women's Association had organized. She wrote to a colleague describing the work of the preceding months: the supplies gathered, the wounded processed, the organizational challenges overcome. And then she wrote something that has stayed with every historian who has read it. She wrote, "We have done what was required of us, and we have asked nothing in return but that it be remembered that we did it." It was not remembered, not in the way she meant, not in the way she had earned. Her letter sat in an archive for nearly 200 years, unread by most of the historians writing about the wars of liberation. It is read now. Scholars know it. But Louise von Plotz is not in the textbooks. The women she worked with are not in the textbooks. They did what was required, and history failed them. Consider what it means to make a choice like the ones these women made. Consider the context fully. You are a woman in occupied Prussia, or Spain, or Russia. You have no more legal rights worth speaking of. You have no more formal standing. The institutional structures of your society, the military, the government, the church, are either controlled by the occupying power or so constrained that they cannot protect you. If you are caught acting against the occupation, there is no more due process that will protect you. There is no more legal framework that will advocate for you. If you are shot, there will be no more inquiry. If you are imprisoned, there will be no more record. And yet you choose to act. You choose to hide the courier in your cellar. You choose to carry the message through the checkpoint. You choose to maintain the hospital, to melt down your jewelry, to organize your neighbors, to stand at the abandoned cannon. You make the choice not because anyone will remember that you made it. History has proven that they will not. You make it because it is necessary, because someone has to, because the cost of inaction is a future you cannot accept. There is a word for that. The word is courage, and it is owed to these women, regardless of whether history has been willing to pay it. The armies of Napoleon were defeated at Leipzig in 1813 and at Waterloo in 1815 by soldiers who are named and remembered. Their generals have statues. Their battles have anniversaries. Their stories are taught to every schoolchild in Europe. The women who helped make those victories possible, who kept the resistance alive when it might have died, who built the networks that starved and harassed and economically undermined the empire that those soldiers finally broke, they have no more statues. Their battles have no more anniversaries. Their names are in the archives, in the private letters, in the records of occupied territory, in the occasional memoir. They are said if you look. They have always been said if you look. History chose not to look. We are looking now. But looking now does not undo 200 years of deliberate forgetting. It does not give Louise von Plotz her due. It does not restore Eleanor Prohaska to the prominence she deserves. It does not put the names of the nameless partisan women of Spain and Russia into any book that students will actually read. What it does is establish the truth. And the truth is this: the defeat of Napoleon was not achieved by men alone. It was achieved by people, by the full breadth of the populations that his empire had subjugated and exploited and tried to permanently diminish. Among those people, women organized and fought and died in numbers and in ways that the historical record has consistently minimized. The forgotten army was real. It was large. It was effective. It was brave. And the forgetting of it was not an accident. So this one more thing to say, one more thread to pull. Because the era of women from the history of the Napoleonic resistance did not end in the 19th century, it continued into the 20th. It continued in the way that the academic discipline of military history developed, with its focus on battles and campaigns and commanders and its institutional resistance to sources that documented civilian experience. It continued in the popular culture in the films, the novels, the documentaries that told the story of the Napoleonic era as a story of men. It continued in the fairy language we used to talk about this period. We say that Napoleon was defeated at Leipzig. We say that the coalition defeated Napoleon. We use passive constructions that erase agency and active constructions that center armies. The networks, the hospitals, the smugglers, the couriers, the women at the checkpoints with baskets of bread and intelligence reports folded inside them. They disappear into the grammar of how we tell the story. And that matters, because the stories we tell about the past are the stories we tell about what is possible, about who has the capacity to change history, about whose actions are worth remembering and analyzing and drawing lessons from. If the story you tell about Napoleon's defeat is a story only about armies and generals, you are telling a story about what only armies and generals can do. You are telling a story that leaves most of the human race out. If you tell the fuller story, if you include the forgotten army, if you put the women of Spain and Prussia and Russia and the smuggling networks of Northern Europe back into the flame, you are telling a different story, a truer story. A story about the breadth of human resistance, about the forms that courage takes when conventional forms are unavailable, about the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when the alternative is submission. That story has been buried for 200 years. It should not stay buried. History has a gravity. It pulls toward the powerful, toward the documented, toward the people who were already considered important enough to record. It takes what to resist that gravity. It takes historians willing to look at new sources and ask new questions. It takes institutions willing to fund that work and publish those findings. It takes the rest of us being willing to sit with the discomfort of a past that is more complicated and more morally demanding than the one we were taught. The women who refused to submit to Napoleon did not have the luxury of comfort. They acted in the world as it was, not as it should have been. They built what they could build in the spaces they were allowed to occupy. And what they built, when you look at it honestly and fully, was remarkable. They helped end an empire. And they asked, quietly, in letters that almost no one read, only that it be remembered. We owe them the remembering. We owe them more than that. But we can start, sir. The forgotten army of women who helped defeat Napoleon Bonaparte was real. They existed. They acted. They mattered. History buried them. But the ground gives up its dead.